All right, my watch just went off, so it's 3 o'clock on the dot. We'll go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us for our next presentation of the spring semester, Faculty Council HawkTalks. Our featured presenters today include Dr. Carrie Keller and Dr. Amy Proctor. Dr. Keller received her Bachelor's of Science in Criminal Justice with an emphasis in legal studies from Northeastern State University. She earned her Juris Doctorate and a certificate in educational statistics and research methods from the University of Arkansas. And she currently serves as the Dean of the Graduate College. Prior to this appointment, she served as the Assistant Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and the Chair of the Department of Criminal Justice and Legal Studies. Her research interests include campus victimization and campus safety. As well, we have Dr. Amy Proctor, and she received her BA and MA in criminal justice from the University of Arkansas, Little Rock, and her PhD from Sam Houston State University. Dr. Proctor joined the NSU faculty in 2008, and her research interests include the intersection between race, specifically Native Americans, and gender with crime and victimization. She has traveled to over 15 federally recognized Indian reservations across the United States, conducting qualitative research regarding the nature and extent of drug use and distribution in Indian country as part of the Tribal Methamphetamine Initiative. She has also worked as a consultant with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Tribal Justice Support, and the U.S. Senate Committee on Indian Affairs. Dr. Proctor teaches various courses in criminology, and her current research is quantitative in nature and focuses on fear of crime and victimization among college students on campus and Title IV implications. For this HawkTalk presentation, Drs. Carrie Keller and Dr. Amy Proctor will highlight their recently published chapter on campus crime and victimization. The presentation is entitled Campus Crime and Victimization, Implications for Institutions of Higher Education. There will be time at the end of the presentation for Q&A. So please, if you would, at this point, to join me in welcoming Dr. Carrie Keller and Dr. Amy Proctor.
Hi, everybody, and thank you all very much for being with us today. On behalf of Amy and myself, we are honored to be able to talk with you about this specific piece of our research, but she and I have been working on campus crime and victimization surveys for a few years now, and we've done 2 iterations of a crime and victimization survey that is relevant to a piece of what we're going to be speaking to here today. I do want to caveat that this specific work was written for an audience of higher education administrators. And so its voice is in that tone and from that perspective. And so be thinking when you're contemplating what we will share with you today, what the implications would be for institutions like NSU, but all institutions. And so I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to share my screen. Amy, did I say everything I need to say up front?
I believe so.
Okay. And I don't know how this is operated. If you guys have questions, do you put them in the chat? Or I think Dr. Lauterbach, you said they're held to the end. Okay. We'll go with holding them to the end. And if you want to put them in the chat so that we recognize what we need or have time to contemplate what you are going to ask while one of us is talking, the other one can be thinking about how to respond. That would be helpful. So I'm going to go ahead and share. And hopefully you see our intro slide. And Dr. Proctor is going to get us started by talking about the federal legislation and the case law that guides all reporting on campus crime and victimization, its history, and what those standards are that we are currently operating under today.
Thank you, Carrie, and thank you, Dr. Lauterbach, for allowing me to present today. There are really 3 main federal laws that guide the reporting of crime and victimization on campus. The first is the Clery Act, then the VAWA, Violence Against Women Act, and then, of course, Title IX of the Educational Amendments of 1972. From there, case law has developed that has further outlined what an institution's liability can be under Title IX. And so that's what I'll be speaking about today. So the Clery Act, I don't know if everybody is familiar with the facts of Clery, but Jean Ann Clery was a student at Lehigh University who was raped and murdered in her dorm room. And through the investigation, her parents found out that the university had failed to inform them that there had been multiple incidences of violence and crime on campus that they had not informed their stakeholders of. And they successfully sued the university, and with the proceeds developed a fellowship of sort to led to lobby Congress in enacting requirements for universities to share their statistics of crime and victimization on campus. So the Clery Act requires disclosure of a public crime log and the implementation of a warning system for ongoing public safety threats. It further requires institutions to publish these annual reports to current students, employees, any applicants for enrollment or employment, if they request it, containing the campus crime statistics. They also have to publish their campus security policies and report any crimes that have also been reported to local law enforcement. Now, those crimes that they are required to report on include criminal homicide, non-negligent manslaughter, forcible rape, sexual assault, robbery, burglary, motor vehicle theft, and hate crimes. VAWA, which was initiated several years ago, but in 2013, when they reauthorized the Violence Against Women Act, President Obama required that colleges and universities do several things. And the first was to adopt the federal definition of forcible rape so that there is consistency, and to make sure that both genders, at a time, the federal definition of forcible rape did not include men as victims. It was a crime that could only be perpetrated against women. So when the federal definition changed to include men or women, then the VAWA Act requires that the universities do the same. It also requires them to report statistics of dating violence, domestic violence, and stalking, and to include hate crimes that are centered around gender identity and or national origin. Now, this came about for a couple of different reasons. There are several studies that have found, various statistics about the presence and the extent of sexual assault on campus. So one study found 19% of women experienced completed or attempted sexual assault since they entered college. And further, there was anecdotal evidence through media reports and other sources by female college students who were coming out and saying, look, colleges and universities are not reporting what's happening, or they're not properly reporting the assaults that are happening on campus. And so that brought about that change. Title IX, and this is the big one that we all have to go through training for every year. And it is the one we probably hear the most about, that really outlines the liability that institutions of higher education have when it comes to crime and victimization on campus. So Title IX basically prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex in any federally funded education program or activity. It covers gender-based sexual assaults, such as making unwanted comments, advances, and or name calling on the basis of sex, which is a form of sex discrimination. So within the Department of Education, which is overseeing, of course, this Title IX, is the Office of Civil Rights, and that's what OCR means there on the third bullet point. The goals of the Office of Civil Rights are to get institutions to voluntarily comply with the investigation, the resolution, and the prevention of Title IX claims. In addition, OCR has OCR is authorized to terminate federal funding if schools fail to implement those necessary investigations, protocols, policies, and if they act with deliberate indifference in regard to student compliance. Now, deliberate indifference is the legal equivalency of liability. Excuse me 1 second, I'm sorry.
Do I need to move on, Amy?
No, it's okay. It is the intentional failure to act in a situation where remedial action is required. So under Title IX, the institution must provide notice to students, parents, and employees of the procedure for filing a complaint of sexual harassment and where those complaints can be filed. And then they have to ensure that that procedure is followed and that there's an adequate, reliable, and impartial investigation of the complaints, and that this must include the opportunity to present witnesses and present other evidence. It's also to ensure designated and reasonably prompt timeframes for the major stages of the complaint process so that it doesn't stall and it's not carried over a long period of time. And they're required to provide notice to the parties of the outcome of the complaint and to provide assurance that the school is going to take steps to prevent the recurrence of any harassment and to correct its discriminatory effects on the complainant and others. The courts have also found that institutions that fail to comply with the policy and procedural requirements can be held liable through the court system. And the courts have determined that litigants have recourse by filing a private rights action when their school acts with deliberate indifference in the grievance process. So they ruled that money damages may be one way that this wrong can be made right when schools fail to act in a timely and reasonable manner. To do so, there are certain facts that must be proven to the court before there can be an assessment of monetary damages. And those facts are these: that the petitioner must demonstrate that his or her institution receives federal funds, that they had actual as opposed to constructive knowledge of harassment, that they responded to such knowledge with deliberate indifference, and they deprived him or her of equal access to educational opportunities through its clearly unreasonable response to severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive harassment. So this is a very high standard for complainants to meet. And according to the research is done in rare cases, but those that go forward are very costly for the institution to address. They're time consuming, and they're really likely to garner negative publicity in the media. There are two main court cases that have come about to further guide institutions on what their responsibilities are under Title IX. So colleges and universities should be aware of these two standards that have been established by the federal courts concerning their responsibility to act and when they're put on notice of a risk to students. The first is what they have been referred to as early notice, and the other is before the fact deliberate indifference. And these standards were created in this first case of Williams v. Board of Regents of the University System of Georgia, and the other in the Simpson v. University of Colorado at Boulder. In Williams, the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals created the early notice and a standard and the before the fact deliberate indifference. In this case, a woman, Tiffany Williams, was having consensual sex with a basketball player, Tony Cole, and unbeknownst to her, there was another man, Brandon Williams, in the closet in the dorm room where they were having this consensual sex who was watching. when Tony Cole got up to excuse himself from the bed to the restroom, Brandon Williams came out of the closet, raped and sexually assaulted Tiffany Williams. While in the bathroom, Tony Cole called yet a third man who he invited over and then encouraged to rape and sexually assault Tiffany Williams, which he did. She reported the assault to her mother, to authorities. She went to the hospital for treatment, and she withdrew from the university all in the same day. No recourse was taken against any of the players. In a legal system, Tony Cole was actually acquitted of the charges of rape and sexual assault, and the prosecutor declined to press charges on the two other men. So Tiffany sued the university because she claimed that the university head men's basketball coach, the athletic director, and the president were all personally involved in recruiting and admitting that student, Tony Cole, even though they were aware of his previous disciplinary and criminal misconduct, particularly involving the sexual harassment of women at the colleges he attended prior to going to the University of Georgia. Now, the court narrowly construed this to include only those cases where the school had prior knowledge, and that creates that early notice standard of the alleged perpetrator's previous misconduct. Admitted or hired the perpetrator and then failed to monitor or provide counseling to the alleged perpetrator, therefore creating that before the fact and deliberate indifference. The University of Colorado at Boulder is similar to the Williams case, except for it covers a known pattern of sexual misconduct by members of the same team or organization. It was ruled in this that there had been this repeated behavior by members and recruits or potential students that are being recruited for the football team over several years that was ignored by the school. And so what the court is doing is saying that it's not only applies to an individual that you have knowledge of, but also any groups that you know of that may have this propensity of to engage in sexual discrimination or sexual harassment.
All right, so we're going to switch to what the actual crime looks like on our college campuses. This is going to be data taken nationwide. And just on what Amy was talking about, I don't know if any of you had an opportunity to see or read in the Chronicle what's going on up at Oregon State, but the president of Oregon State he resigned, and I think he was facing being terminated because of covering up sexual improprieties that took place at an institution where he was at previously. So this is all very pertinent and timely. All of the reporting requirements and the burdens and standards placed upon institutions in the event that any criminal activity takes place and is not dealt with appropriately, it not only impacts that institution, but it impacts individuals when they leave institutions as well. So what does the crime actually look like on our campuses? And there are different crime categories, but Raines and Henson in 2020 did some research of the national campus crime statistics and found that there are basically 4 identifiable consistent crime categories on our campuses. And you can classify crime in a number of ways. I mean, when we talk about crime, we might classify it as violent versus nonviolent, or personal versus property, or completed versus attempted. But if you're looking at it or talking about it from a college campus perspective, you'll look at personal, property, sexual victimization, or cybercrime. Personal crimes are those that, of course, involve person to person, an assault where someone is threatening to injure another, a robbery where they take or steal property through the threat of force or through an act of force. And then, of course, homicide is where you take the life of another individual. I will say that sexual victimization is clearly a personal crime, but it happens prevalently enough that it is given its own category when we are dealing or discussing campus victimization. Property crimes deal with, of course, theft, which is the taking of another person's property, burglary, which is breaking and entering into an area that is not under your control or without your permission, and then vandalism is where you damage or destroy another person's property. Sexual victimization, when we talk about that, typically includes rape, which Dr. Proctor defined as the unconsensual penetration of another, and then sexual assault, which could be the attempted rape. It can be an inappropriate touching of some sort that is not rape. It could also, sexual victimization can involve other personal types of crimes like stalking and harassment. And then a crime category that is becoming much more prevalent in contemporary discussions relates to cybercrime. I'll have more on this in a second, but that includes cyber stalking, cyberbullying, cyber harassment, and online mischievousness. So let me just make sure that there's nothing more I want to say about that right now. And then I'll talk about sources of data. So where do we collect our data on campus crime and victimization? And remember that our campus crime and victimization includes more than what happens on the campus itself. It includes what happens on the campus or what happens in or on any institutionally owned property or on the streets that are adjacent to the campus. So if you have campus owned fraternity or sorority houses, playhouses, any type of property that is off campus, it is still considered the campus. And then if you have any crime that occurs, like a car breaking and entering on a street that is adjacent to that campus, it would be included in this data. We have unreported and reported. So our main sources for reported crimes, if you're ever involved in or want to do this type of research, you're going to look, first of all, at the Department of Education's Campus Security Survey, and that's what I refer to as the CSS. And this is the required disclosure of any incidents that are reported to campus police or that are reported to local police authorities, and the campus has notice of that, or that is reported to a campus security authority. And a campus security authority is a non-law enforcement individual on campus who is responsible for student safety. Typically, we associate these individuals with coaches, or we associate them with conduct officers or resident assistants. So the CSS reporting boundaries, like I said, include more than what is on campus, but those things that are adjacent to campus or that are owned by the campus. Then another source for reported crime includes the FBI's Uniform Crime Reports. And there's about 18,000 municipal, county, state, college, or tribal law enforcement agencies in the United States that are required to report incidents that fall within two classifications of crime to the FBI. And then they tabulate and release information on that data. So often, though, these numbers are not the same. You will see some variance, as I'll show you when it comes to sexual victimization here in just a second. And most of your college victimization, your crimes that occur involving college students, though, are going to go unreported. However, there are a couple of great resources to identify those or what the evidence of those crimes looks like. First of all is your National Crime Victimization Survey. And so this survey is issued annually. It's actually sent out twice a year, every year, and the data are obtained from representative samples of about 49,000 households. So they try to get about 100,000 persons, and they deal with frequency characteristics or consequences of victimization in the United States. And this specific source does screen for college versus non-college students. So it doesn't necessarily ask where it occurred if it was on a campus, but you can look at differences, and there's some interesting differences in victimology between non-college students and college students. The Campus Climate Survey, this title is given to a lot of different surveys out there, but this is the American Association of Universities Campus Climate Survey, and this is specifically about sexual harassment, stalking, intimate partner violence, or other sexual offenses. It was issued in 2015 and then repeated in 2019 to 33 institutions across the United States of various size and scope of mission. And they look at victim characteristics, they look at reporting patterns, and then they also look at the climate surrounding institutional response. And then another really great resource for data on campus crime and victimization are your regional or your local studies. Both Amy and I have worked on these, and there are some other authors that if you ever have occasion to want to look into that data, we can definitely turn you on to some good sources. So overall, in terms of reported crime, and I took 2017 as my data point here because you always have that when you're dealing with any type of reporting, you always have at least a year lag. And then we had COVID. So I didn't trust the data that was coming upon that time frame. So 2017, 38,000 incidents of crime were reported nationally. And because criminal offenses occur differently in college campuses against college students, they could be by college students, reported by differing agencies, as I demonstrated on the previous slide. This is a summary of all of those data points. And currently in the United States, you have about 6,000 colleges and universities that are eligible to receive financial aid. So this is 38,000 incidents reported among those 6,000 institutions. They serve about 20 million students. So a majority of the crime reported did occur on campus, 78%, about 22% off campus. Interestingly, this was an increase between 2014 and 2017, close to 5%. Prior to that time, they had seen a trend downward. So I don't know exactly what happened in between those years, but we did see an increase, and it will be interesting to see the impact that COVID has had. Of course, it will go down. So in terms of the victimization characteristics, what do the victims of campus crime actually look like? Most of your campus crimes are going to be nonviolent. Sexual victimization receives most of the press. Title IX really focuses on sexual victimization, and with the trauma associated with sexual victimization, that is very understood. Outside of sexual victimization, campus shootings or mass violence garners the second most amount of press coverage. In 2017, there were only 49 deaths on all of our college campuses. And so it's actually very rare that you're going to see that level of offense. Most of your incidents are going to be theft or some type of property crime. So larceny is consistently accounting for more than 70% of all reported crimes, and both males and females are more likely to be a victim of theft or another property crime than they are a crime of violence. Fisher has done a lot of research in this area. They suggest that college students are at greater risk for victimization. But Hart did a follow-up study and found that non-college students experienced higher rates of violent victimization than college students. So when it comes to breaking down college versus non-college students and whether or not there is a significant difference. Is one at a greater risk than the other? There really is not, we don't know. It's not clear at this point, but we do know that if there is violent crime against a college student, it is more likely to occur off campus. And race is not important here. And I put that in there because both Dr. Proctor and I, in our campus crime and victimization surveys, have focused on what differences are present due to race, or specifically Native versus non-Native, because Native Americans are more likely to be victims of crime than any other ethnic or racial population. And so we wanted to know in our research if that difference held true. It's beyond the scope of today's discussion, but the National Crime Victimization data for all race and ethnic categories reviewed between 1992 and 2002 indicated that American Indians were more than twice as likely to experience violent crime. But when Hart reviewed the same data for 95 through 2004, they did not find that disparity among the races. Instead, they found that white, Black, and Hispanic college students were at a greater risk of violent victimization. So we don't know at this point. Sexual victimization. So that first bullet point, there's a discrepancy in the data reported to the FBI and the CSS. So you can see that in 2017, the same year, and one, the UCR, there were 1,500 rapes reported, but through the CSS, which is what universities and colleges report to, 7,500 rapes. Why the difference? One is the definition of rape that is used by each. The UCR uses the federal definition of rape, which is only the inappropriate, unconsensual sexual penetration, whereas the CSS lumps all sexual victimization together. And then also, it could be that there was not clear reporting lines between the college or university and the local law enforcement involved. The Campus Climate Survey in 2019 found that about 26% of females and close to 7% of the male undergraduate students that were included in that survey experienced a rape or forced sexual contact. And that was a 3% increase from their 2015 study. And the Department of Justice does estimate that about 1 in 4 female undergraduate students will experience sexual victimization. There's another statistic out there from a study that was done by Fisher that links it closer to 1 in 5. Regardless, it's a very high number that is likely to experience some type of sexual victimization. Female college students are, of course, 2 times as likely to experience sexual victimization as they are robbery, which is a crime of violence. But it's very interesting when you're looking at college versus non-college sexual victimization. Female college students are 3 times less likely to experience rape or forced sexual contact than non-college students. So as much as it's happening on college campuses, or the surveys are showing that the likelihood of being a victim on a college campus, it's actually higher if you are not a college student. And male college students are 4 times more likely to experience sexual victimization than non-college students. So that was interesting to me. I would have expected that to have been reversed, but. Cybercrime. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this except to say it is a growing area of study. It's a growing area of concern because technology is now required as to be used. Even if it wasn't required, it's a part of the Gen Z and now maybe the Gen C It's a part of their person and extension. They communicate more frequently on or through tech than they do in person. They use it for their courses. They use it for work. They use it to engage with one another. And it's becoming increasingly used to perpetrate crime. So it's very important to campuses to keep a pulse on this, because that technology actually could be owned by the university. And so there could be some liability there. These crimes could occur remotely. They occur asynchronously, and they have the potential for anonymity. The most famous case, I think, that was in the press in the last few years was a case where a young man was having sexual engagement with another in his dorm room, and someone filmed it and then posted it on the internet. That young man ended up committing suicide from that. So there's not a lot of studies out there. Most of the studies are local, only from 1 or 2 institutions. And so that's an area where there's a need for further research. So that's what we know in terms of the reported or surveyed victimization. This is really important to college administration. When we report our data and what is made known to us and we react upon, it's just the tip of the iceberg of what is likely happening. And I put these data on here to show consistently a pattern from 1997 through 2016. Crime is significantly unreported, particularly in the area of sexual victimization. So why? Why do people not want to report crimes? And particularly when you're dealing with the college student age group, they have a fear of reprisal from their peers. They have a fear of reprisal from those who are in positions of authority. They believe that it is a personal matter. They don't want to get the offender in trouble. This is true particularly for sexual offenses. They think it would be viewed as their fault. This is particularly true for victims of color and those that have engaged in any type of drinking activity as a precursor to the crime. And the most frequently cited reason for not reporting a sexual offense is that it wasn't serious enough. They didn't think it was serious enough. So the idea that if it's not full-on rape, it's not serious enough to report. I wanted to call your attention to the 2016 bullet point. In 2016, 89% of the institutions of higher education that reported to the Campus Security Survey reported 0 rapes or sexual assaults. So what are the policy implications? Most of you in here are faculty. There's a few administrators in here. I think the most primary and important policy implication to us outside of the liability of the institution and outside of the personal liability of people involved would be retention and retaining our students. So of course, there's physical and mental trauma for serious offenses, financial implications for property crimes, and the fear of crime. Fisher, in 2000, found that 20% of college rape and sexual assault crimes included physical injuries to the victim beyond the actual sexual trauma. Mango and Black in 2016 did a study looking at associations between crime, GPA, and dropout rates. And they found significant associations in the semester where the crime occurred between the beginning and the ending dropout rate. I'm sorry, the beginning and the ending GPA, and then also the dropout rate. And then in terms of fear of crime, female students are much more likely to be fearful than males. And this is, of course, going to impact their engagement with the university, their engagement with their peers, and their engagement with those that would be able to provide them the type of help and resources that they need. And this is due to what Ferraro has called the shadow hypothesis, where women perceive a vulnerability to rape or personal offenses that lead to rape. And so that vulnerability makes them more fearful of crime. So if the institution itself does not feel safe, even if their risk of being a victim is slight, then that may prevent them from engaging in the campus in a way that would really impact their persistence. And their lifetime experience with crime is also very important. Amy, I don't know if you want to, this fear of crime is kind of within your wheelhouse here. And so is there anything you want to add to that? You're on mute.
I think you covered everything, but yeah, it's just real important, like that it will even affect their attendance in the classroom. I remember us looking at one study about students once they've been victims are so worried about seeing their perpetrator on campus or in class, and that was keeping them from fully engaging in all of the benefits of the university, including an education and all of the social aspects as well.
All right, policy implications. We need a community approach.
Part of this community approach comes from the literature on community policing. And community policing has been defined as a philosophy of policing that's based on this concept that police officers and private citizens working together in creative ways can help solve contemporary community problems related to crime, fear of crime, social and physical disorder, and neighborhood decay. Now, this philosophy is predicated on the belief that this is going to require police departments to develop relationship with law-abiding people in the community to allow them a greater participation and voice in setting local priorities, involving them in efforts to improve quality of life in their communities. And it really shifts the police work from handling these random reactive calls to problem solving to more proactive problem solving and proactive policing. So one of the first things that we can implemented, there we go, are campus crime and victimization surveys. And I know that Carrie has covered several different sources of data that can be used to look at crime and victimization on campus, but those are not going to give you all of the information, or they may not give you all the information that you need about your particular campus or our particular campus. So even though universities are required to compile and report their crime statistics, they may not give it an accurate picture. The of campus surveys will provide administrators and campus law enforcement context, and it may reveal those crimes that have gone unreported. It's astounding to me that you see this statistic of 89% of institutions of higher education had 0 rapes or sexual assault. That's a ridiculous, in my opinion, statistic. It really shows that there is a vast underreporting. These self-report surveys can provide important information on the victims of crime beyond just their basic demographics, their age, their race, so forth, so on and so forth. It can provide information such as their drug and alcohol use or the drug and alcohol use of their perpetrator. It can provide information on their lifestyle or their routine activities. In the campus crime victimization survey that Carrie and I have conducted, we also asked students to talk about places where they felt most vulnerable or that didn't feel real safe. And we also asked the students to let us know what their level of satisfaction was with campus law enforcement and safety. And so we're getting a lot more information when you do those those types of campus crime and victimization surveys, as opposed to just relying on all those other sources of data.
To the reporting piece of that, Amy, I think in one of our iterations, we identified, was it 17 rapes, but the institution only had one reported that year.
It was something like that, yes.
Yeah. So, and that just means that we don't know what we don't know.
Exactly.
So another prevention or a community approach would be the prevention programming aimed at mitigating criminal opportunity. And universities do quite a bit of this. They do this in the student engagement activities that they have with students during their Greek life, during Welcome Week. You guys may have all participated in some of those. A type of training that is gaining a lot of traction that universities should look into is called bystander intervention training. I actually saw a news piece on this as it was related to the shooting in Atlanta in the last week and how bystanders could have intervened. Bystander intervention training essentially looks at how other participants who are not engaged in the criminal activity could intervene to somehow mitigate the opportunity for it to take place. For example, if you have a young woman who goes to a party and she engages in drinking and she drinks to a point where she's obviously intoxicated and a couple of guys go up to her and they're like, hey, let's dance. Then if her sorority friends would go up and say, oh, you know what? I think it's time for us to go over here and actually take her and do something else. How do we encourage those who are participating to look out for criminal behavior and to intervene in a way that is comfortable for them, that is comfortable and doesn't create too much of a peer pressure, that they would be willing to engage in that prevention opportunity. And so bystander intervention training is something that institutions should definitely look into. Related to that is looking at the environment of your campus. And two of the most prevalent ways of doing that is situational crime prevention or crime prevention through environmental design, so SCP or CPTED. And these are really looking for where crime is occurring on your campus and how you can change the environment to prevent that crime from occurring. So it could be lighting, locks, it could be electronic tracking through apps. To give you an example, if you see that you have a high rate of thefts of electronic devices, then you could maybe have a program where you give out tracking, little trackers, like those little squares that the college students could put on their phones and or other electronic device like their laptop. And that would serve the role of a guardian or harden the target or mitigate the opportunity for that crime to occur. And creating that social guardian is really what that bystander intervention is about too.
And the final policy implication, really embracing this community approach, would be the creation of a campus safety team. And it's recommended that this team consists of not only campus law enforcement, but physical plant operations, mental and behavioral health experts, the campus emergency director, the dean of students or a similar position, and others such as Greek life leaders, which I think is extremely important to have on there since we've seen them be held liable for things that have happened during their engagements. Also a campus violence prevention coordinator, the student conduct coordinator, retention specialist, and student representatives. Also, I think that a university would be remiss not to include athletic directors as part of that team approach to campus safety, since research has shown repeatedly for sexual harassment, sexual assault, rape to be a problem within male sports, specifically teams and gatherings and recruitment. Carrie, going back to the bystander information, I was just reading about another case that happened not too long ago in Utah when Lauren McCluskey was raped and murdered by a man who was stalking her on campus. He was a non-student, where her roommates and her friends tried to intervene, and the university just didn't really take it seriously. And that was actually cited in the court case, that they had ignored these calls by her friends and that the university should have paid attention to those closest to her. So it's important that we not only train our students, but we also train this team to pay attention to those around the potential or alleged victim.
All right, I think with that, I'm going to stop sharing and ask if you guys have any questions. I think that there's some questions, or I think Nick asked a question. I trust that racist hateful rhetoric would be classified as a personal crime. Actually, I think that that's going to, Dr. Nassim, go into the hate crime category. And hate crimes are personal crimes.
So I was just wondering if we can, between personal and cyber, because it can be, if a racist harassment can also occur through social media. So how would we classify that? Personal or cyber, or maybe
for research purposes, they tend to look at the medium in which they're using to conduct their harassment. So if they are using some kind of technological device, they'll classify it or label it under cybercrime. What I think an interesting fact that you're alluding to here is that it be stalking in itself requires 2 or more events. And so one of those events may take place through a cyber or through a technological device, and then others might happen in person. It could be kind of a combination effect. For research purposes, if any technological device is used, it's all lumped into cybercrime. We do have a safety team at NSU. It's called the Behavioral Intervention Team.
And are there differences on the institution campus locations such as urban, suburban, and rural? There has been research that's done requiring, there has been research done that's answered those questions. And there is a difference between the urban specifically and the rural. I'm not totally sure about suburban. Carrie, have you seen anything on suburban?
I haven't seen anything that's specifically classified as
a lot more of it with the urban locations. Obviously, being in the city, it was more adjacent to campus rather than on campus, however.
I would say geographically, that's an important point. Yeah. Also, in terms of crime happening adjacent to campus or with property that is owned by the campus, the larger, of course, the institution, then the more crime you're going to see, or the larger their athletic programs. And that's not to say that athletes are the problem. It's just that that's what draws the crowds. And where there are more people together, where alcohol is involved, then there's going to be more opportunity and likelihood of crime.
How can faculty support the intervention training? Carrie, that's kind of your area of specialty.
I don't know for sure that we have bystander intervention training here. It's fairly new training. I would have to look into that. And they may not label it as bystander intervention training if they have it. So for example, when, and Jessica, you may know who is over this, but I don't know who's over Greek life, but they do a lot of activities and training with the Greek leadership. And so they may be incorporating principles as they are doing that training. It's not always lumped into a specific or separate training, but the principles of bystander intervention training can be incorporated into any type of crime prevention programming.
I would think that you could even maybe do a section of that in like university strategies. First year,
Right.
let's get them engaged and let's teach them how to protect themselves and how to protect those around
Other.
too. I think that there's an opportunity to do that there.
That's good. That's a really good point.
Dr. Keller, I don't know of a specific training, but any faculty, staff, student can report a concern, and
Mhm.
that will go on. So at the bottom, there's of any of NSU's web pages, there's a link, report a concern, and you can kind of base on what the event is. That will filter through. But if it's something in terms of safety, yeah, the BIT team does get involved, and we meet once a week to discuss the caseload and where we need to go.
And I think, Jessica, the BIT team looks pretty much like what we have suggested and what institutions should be including on those campus safety teams. Some institutions have a representative for this at the cabinet level, or they bring them in or have regular dialogue at the executive cabinet level. I don't know that ours is of the size where it would be necessary to do that.
Well, and we do bring in people, we have our core group, but if there's a situation that does require maybe somebody else coming in, we do have guests that come in and sit on a certain case. But yeah, there's two from advising, conduct, Hawk Reach, the student advocate. Dr. Sheila Self sits on it. She's the main leader. We have Captain Bell sits on there, as well as another police officer. So there's quite a few of us that meet together and just try to get all the information together from all aspects. Because one of the things you mentioned for sure was the as far as my side goes with advising, I see whether or not there's been an early alert. Has the student been going to class? Missing, there's a lot of missed assignments, and that usually can be, or midterm grades, that can kind of be a window into maybe something's going on that we need to look into.
And it's not always the crime that may occur on campus either. It could be criminal activity that our students face in their communities, in their home life. A lot of the benefit of the victimization surveys is that you can find out lifetime victimization data about your students. So, coming in.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Keller, I think I was struck by one of the statistics you put up that up to between 75 and 90% of some crimes, especially rape, are not reported. I was curious, is that number of rapes that have been reported locally and don't get reported to a national database, or an estimation of how many rapes occur that are just not reported at all? And if it's the latter case, how do you get that number? Do you just do surveys and say this has happened and you didn't report it? Or?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they look at what is actually reported, and then they compare that to their surveys of self-report. And most of those surveys do ask if they have reported it to an official. And so there could be that direct question, but then they estimate based on probability.
So the UCR, the Uniform Crime Report, consists of only crimes known to the police. As our other big national source of crime data is the National Crime and Victimization Survey, which is actually overseen by the Census Bureau. And that they go to the respondent's home and do in-person interviews and then follow-up telephonic interviews at 6-month intervals over 3 years. So it's in those self-report, like the National Crime Victimization Survey, looking at that versus the UCR, which is the official reporting, that we find that what we call the dark figure of crime. In this instance, the dark figure of sexual assault or rape, that the respondents in the NCVS have said, no, I didn't report it to a police officer, and this is why. The other source of information on officially reported to police versus unreported came from hospital emergency room data, looking at women who had presented themselves for treatment for sexual assault or rape, and those that actually reported it to the police versus those who opted not to. And we saw these huge discrepancies. And that's when we started asking more questions about, did you report this officially to police? Did you report it to somebody in authority or a family member or so that's where you have to really read exactly what the research is reporting and where they're getting their statistics to understand those big numbers.
That was what's surprising to me is, as I've understood my role at NSU of being a mandatory reporter, is a sane nurse not also a mandatory reporter? If a female patient presents and says, I have been sexually assaulted, I need a kit, there's no obligation for that nurse to report that to the police?
No, there is no obligation for them to report that to the police. That is up to the victim. Now, they may call the police to the hospital, but it's going to be up to the victim whether or not they want to make an official report to give that information. And remember, this happens a lot between people who know one another. And so that victim is often very, very scared of retaliation, not to mention embarrassment, or especially with colleges, there's been alcohol or drug use. And so a lot of times victims don't want to report or
prior consensual activity.
Consensual activity. And they won't report at the hospital. And then maybe a day or two later, they decide to report themselves.
Mm-hmm.
The sane nurses are not required.
Do I have that correct? I have not had a student do this, but I often tell students when they talk to me, if they come in obviously distraught, I tell them, before you speak to me, I need to let you know I'm a mandatory reporter. It's my impression if a student came to me and said, I have been raped,
you have to report.
I have to report that, right?
Yeah, you do.
Yes.
Yeah.
Why would that not be the same for a sane nurse?
I think that
I think it's HIPAA. I think it's a privacy issue, health privacy issue. But they're not a mandatory report. Now, let me say this, for people 18 years and older, if a child is presented, then, or a minor in the state under state law, then they would be required.
that mandatory reporting is a double-edged sword.
Yes.
Right? Because we know, I completely understand why the law has included that. But knowing the reluctance of victims to come forward, particularly for sexual assaults, I think that it's a baby step process. I mean, my very limited experience with sexual assault crimes when I worked in a prosecutor's office, is very limited, is that it is a process that unless that there is physical trauma to the individual where they have to go, it might take a few days and baby step talking to a few people, particularly where there is some type of connection with the perpetrator.
I think too, there's an issue of power when it comes, obviously, with rape and sexual assault. And so the research with SANE and also female police officers who take reports of rape is that it's very important for the victim to feel like they have their power over their body, their autonomy.
Right.
It's a decision whether or not to go forward with reporting. They may want medical treatment because they've been hurt, but they are not interested in going on to law enforcement for whatever reasons. And so part of that, them having a say, not being mandatory to report that crime, is giving that victim back some autonomy and some self-power.
Should we have that same flexibility?
As mandatory reporters?
Should we be mandatory reporters if, in the same way, if a sane nurse isn't? I mean, I guess you could say, FERPA is not nearly as airtight as HIPAA, but.
I would say unless we want a $13.5 million lawsuit like the University of Utah, then I think we have to keep being mandatory reporters. Because it's a different what we're doing on campus versus what's happening in a public hospital or a private hospital for that.
Thank you.
And I would say that the underreporting of crimes is glaring when it relates to sexual victimization, but it is across the board that there is an underreporting of crime. So a student can have their books stolen and they don't report that. But that's going to have a significant impact on their ability to continue in class, or it could have a financial impact if they have to go and repurchase their books. Then do they have enough money to eat, or do they have enough money to make their car payment? And
Right.
it could be very little. There is research that shows that what we might think is lesser significant criminal incidents have a huge impact on retention. And Jessica, you may have seen some of that in some of your the data that you have access to, or just in talking to students.
Yeah, I'll be honest. I mean, yeah, when as part of my student success component, there's definitely the element of what do I use my money for, the textbooks or food, and whether or not it's retention. And so I do try to forward along the emergency light away fund, but that can't be used for textbooks, but if they need other things. But I don't really, I'm relatively new to BIT, so I don't have a whole lot of data to share with the group in terms of retention and what the BIT team does provide.
That's what we have for you all today.
Any more questions before we wrap this up? Well, again, thank you, Dr. Keller and Dr. Proctor, for providing this information to us. Gives us a little bit more to think about, especially bystander intervention training and how it will affect our students and retention. So again, thank you both for presenting to us all today. I know that we all will be walking away from this presentation with a few pieces of information that will be helpful to us moving forward. I did want to let everyone know that the next Faculty Council HawkTalk is scheduled for Thursday, April 22nd at 3 p.m. and it features Dr. Sophia Sweeney and Catherine Winsett, and their presentation will focus on a book chapter on the topic of teaching strategies and learning environments. So be sure and check your calendars for that. And just as a bit of information, for those of you who may not have joined us before, all of these HawkTalks are recorded and they will be available for you very soon. And they'll be on our Faculty Council website. So again, thank you all for coming today, and for Drs. Proctor and Keller for providing the presentation.
Thank you for allowing us this time. Thank you, everyone.